The wealthy businessman thought he could humiliate her in front of his elite guests, just another invisible musician to mock and dismiss. But when Aaliyah Brooks picked up her guitar one last time that night, she had no idea her haunting melody would shatter Ethan Caldwell's carefully constructed walls and expose the grief he'd been hiding for 2 years. What started as public humiliation would become a journey that neither of them saw coming, one that would force them both to choose between the safety of their separate worlds and the terrifying possibility of real love. Some songs change everything, and some apologies can't undo the damage. Or can they? The tears streaming down his face in front of 30 strangers were just the beginning of a story that would test everything they thought they knew about pride, vulnerability, and second chances. If you want to know how a single song can change 2 lives forever, hit that subscribe button and tell me what city you're watching from. I love connecting with viewers from around the world. Claude é uma IA e pode cometer erros. Por favor, verifique as respostas. The afternoon sun streamed through the thin curtains of Aaliyah's small apartment, casting warm lines across her guitar case. She sat cross-legged on her worn couch, fingers moving gently across the strings. The melody was soft and sad, something she'd been working on for weeks but couldn't quite finish. Her phone buzzed on the coffee table. Rose's name flashed on the screen. "Hey, girl," Aaliyah answered, tucking the phone between her ear and shoulder as she set her guitar aside. "Aaliyah, I need a huge favor." Rose's voice was rushed, stressed. "The musician I hired for tonight just canceled. Food poisoning. I'm catering this fancy party, and they specifically wanted live background music." Aaliyah's stomach tightened. She'd done background music before at Rose's events. Rich people who barely noticed she was there, talking over her songs like she was a radio playing in another room. "I don't know, Rosa, those kinds of parties? I know, but it's good money, really good. And it's just background stuff, nothing fancy. You can play your usual set." Aaliyah looked around her tiny apartment. The rent notice on her kitchen counter caught her eye. 3 days overdue. "How much?" "500, cash." Aaliyah closed her eyes. That would cover rent and groceries for 2 weeks. "What time?" 7:30. It's at this big house up in Riverside Heights. Really nice area. The guy's some kind of business owner, Ethan Caldwell. She'd never heard the name, but Riverside Heights meant money. Old money, probably. The kind that came with expectations and judgment. "Okay," she said quietly. "Text me the address." "Thank you so much. You're saving my life. Wear something nice, but not too nice. You know what I mean." Aaliyah knew exactly what she meant. Nice enough to fit in, not so nice that she'd stand out. Invisible, but professional. She'd mastered that balance over the years. After hanging up, she sat in the quiet of her apartment. Her guitar leaned against the couch, waiting. She picked it up again and played a few chords, something light and easy. Background music, music that wouldn't bother anyone or make them think too hard. At 6:15, she stood in front of her closet, debating between a simple black dress and dark jeans with a nice blouse. The dress won. It was plain, modest, and forgettable. Perfect for blending into expensive wallpaper. She packed her guitar carefully in its case, along with a small amplifier and her folder of sheet music, songs that wouldn't offend anyone. Light jazz, soft rock covers, maybe some acoustic versions of popular songs. Nothing too personal. Nothing that would make her vulnerable. The drive to Riverside Heights took 20 minutes through increasingly fancy neighborhoods. The houses grew larger, the lawns more perfect, the cars more expensive. Aaliyah's old Honda felt smaller with each block. Ethan Caldwell's house sat at the end of a curved driveway, all glass and stone and careful lighting. Cars lined the street outside, sleek sedans and luxury SUVs that probably cost more than she made in 2 years. She parked between a BMW and a Mercedes, feeling like her car was apologizing just for being there. Rosa met her at the side entrance, looking stressed but put together in her catering uniform. "Thank God you're here," Rosa said, hugging her quickly. "Everything's running perfectly, but I was worried about the music situation." She led Aaliyah through a service hallway that opened into the main living area. The space was beautiful in a cold, expensive way. High ceilings, modern furniture that looked like art, and floor-to-ceiling windows that showed off a perfectly maintained backyard with a pool that glowed blue in the evening light. About 30 people moved through the space, all dressed in the kind of casual that cost a fortune. The women wore simple dresses that probably had designer labels, and the men looked comfortable in expensive shirts and tailored pants. Everyone held drinks in crystal glasses and spoke in voices that carried the confidence of never having to worry about rent. "Set up in that corner," Rosa pointed to a spot near the windows. "You'll have good acoustics, but you won't be in anyone's way." Aaliyah nodded and began unplugging her equipment. A few people glanced her way with polite disinterest, the kind of look you'd give furniture being moved into place. She adjusted her amplifier to its lowest setting and tuned her guitar quietly. Through the crowd, she caught sight of a tall man with dark hair talking to an older woman near the kitchen. He had strong shoulders and an expensive watch, and when he laughed at something the woman said, it sounded genuine but careful, like he was always thinking about how he appeared to others. Their eyes met for just a second across the room. His were dark blue, serious, and completely dismissive. He looked at her the way people look at service workers, acknowledgement without real seeing. Then he turned back to his conversation, and she was invisible again. Aaliyah strummed her first chord softly and began to play. The music flowed easily. Songs she'd played 100 times before, jazz standards, soft rock ballads, acoustic versions of hits that everyone would recognize, but nobody would really listen to. Perfect background noise for expensive conversations. And that's exactly what happened. The guests moved around her like she was furniture, talking over her melodies about business deals and vacation plans and people she'd never heard of. She was a soundtrack to their evening, nothing more. A man in his 30s with perfectly styled hair appeared next to the host she'd noticed earlier. He said something that made both men laugh, and she caught a few words. "Nice touch with the mood music, Ethan. Very classy." So the host was Ethan Caldwell. He looked the part, confident, expensive, completely comfortable in his world of crystal glasses and casual wealth. "Daniel thought of everything," Ethan replied, glancing briefly in her direction before looking away. Background ambiance. Background ambiance, that's what she was to them. Aaliyah kept playing, her fingers finding familiar patterns while her mind wandered. This was what she did to pay rent, but it wasn't who she was. At home, alone, she played music that mattered, songs that came from somewhere real and honest. But here, she was just expensive wallpaper with a soundtrack. An hour passed, then another. The conversations grew louder as the drinks flowed. The older woman she'd seen talking to Ethan earlier approached the group of men near the kitchen. She had silver hair and a perfect style, and the kind of posture that came from always being important. "Ethan, darling," she said, touching his arm lightly. "Your father would be so proud of how this turned out tonight." Something shifted in Ethan's face. Just for a moment, his careful expression cracked, and Aaliyah saw something raw underneath. Pain, maybe. Loss. But then the mask slipped back into place, and he smiled politely at the woman. "Thank you, Mother. He always said business was about relationships." "Indeed. Though I still think you work too hard. You need to find some balance in your life." Ethan's jaw tightened slightly. "I'm fine, Mother. Everything is exactly as it should be." Daniel, the friend who'd made the comment about mood music, leaned closer to Ethan. "Speaking of balance, when's the last time you actually relaxed? You've been wound tight for months." "I don't need to relax," Ethan said, his voice getting an edge. "I need to focus." The conversation continued, but Aaliyah could see the tension building in Ethan's shoulders. Whatever was bothering him, he was working hard to keep it buried. She recognized that kind of control. She'd perfected it herself over the years. She transitioned into a softer song, something gentle that might ease the mood. But as she played, she noticed Ethan growing more agitated. He kept checking his watch, shifting his weight, looking around the room like he wanted to escape his own party. Daniel said something else she couldn't catch, but Ethan's response was sharp enough that a few nearby guests turned to look. "Not everything needs to be dissected, Daniel." "Hey, I'm just saying." "Well, don't." The tension was thick enough that even the other guests started to notice. Conversations quieted slightly, that uncomfortable awareness that something was happening, but nobody wanted to acknowledge it directly. Aaliyah kept playing, but she could feel the mood in the room shifting. Whatever control Ethan had been maintaining was starting to slip. That's when it happened. Ethan turned toward her corner, his face flushed with frustration and too much wine. His voice carried clearly across the room, loud enough that everyone could hear. "Could we turn down the elevator music? Some of us are trying to have actual conversations." The room went silent except for her guitar, which she stopped playing immediately. Heat rushed to her face, but she kept her expression calm, professional. 30 pairs of eyes were watching her now, waiting to see what would happen next. A few people laughed, nervous, uncomfortable laughter that made everything worse. Aaliyah set her guitar down carefully and stood up. Every instinct told her to pack up quickly and leave without making a scene. But something deeper, something she'd been pushing down for too long, made her speak instead. "I'm sorry the music is bothering you," she said, her voice steady and polite. "I'll pack up in just a moment. But would it be all right if I played one last song before I go?" Ethan stared at her, probably expecting her to slink away quietly. The room was still silent, everyone frozen in social awkwardness. He started, then stopped. He looked around at his guests, at his mother's disapproving frown, at Daniel's surprised expression. "Fine. One song." Aaliyah sat back down and picked up her guitar. Her hands weren't shaking, but her heart was pounding. She'd never done this before, played something real, something personal, in front of strangers who'd already made it clear what they thought of her. But something about this moment, about being dismissed so casually, broke through all her careful walls. She closed her eyes and began to play. The song that came out wasn't from her professional repertoire. It was something she'd been writing at home, something that came from the deepest, most honest part of her. The melody was haunting and beautiful, filled with all the longing and sadness she usually kept locked away. She sang softly, her voice carrying a pain that couldn't be hidden. "You see right through me like I'm made of glass, like I'm just shadows that you're walking past. But I've got stories that you'll never know, dreams and heartache that don't let me go." The room stayed perfectly silent now, but it was a different kind of quiet. This wasn't awkward social tension. This was the silence of people who were actually listening. "I lost someone who really saw me whole, someone who knew my heart, someone who knew my soul. Now I sing for strangers who don't hear my name, playing background music to their money games." Aaliyah opened her eyes and looked directly at Ethan as she sang the last verse. "Maybe someday you'll remember this, the girl you looked through, the song you almost missed. Maybe someday when you're all alone, you'll wonder about the music that could have been your own." She finished the song and set her guitar down again. The silence stretched on, heavy and profound. She looked around the room and saw expressions she hadn't expected: surprise, discomfort, and something that might have been shame. When she looked at Ethan, she saw tears on his face. He was standing perfectly still, staring at her with an expression of shock and recognition that was impossible to hide. The confident, dismissive mask was completely gone, and in its place was raw vulnerability that made her want to look away. But she didn't look away. She held his gaze for a long moment, letting him see that she saw him seeing her, really seeing her, maybe for the first time. Then she stood up and began packing her equipment. The guests started moving again, conversations resuming in low, awkward murmurs. But the energy in the room had completely changed. What had been casual and comfortable now felt heavy with things nobody wanted to acknowledge. Aaliyah worked quickly, efficiently, keeping her face neutral even though her heart was still racing. She'd never exposed herself like that before, and the vulnerability felt dangerous and necessary at the same time. As she closed her guitar case, she felt someone approach. She looked up to see Ethan standing a few feet away, his face still showing traces of tears he'd tried to wipe away. He started, then stopped. He looked around at the room full of people pretending not to watch them, then back at her. "I'm sorry. What I said was, I'm sorry." Aaliyah nodded once, accepting the apology without making it easier for him. "Thank you." "The song," he said quietly. "It was, who did you lose?" The question was soft, genuine, and it caught her off guard. She almost answered, almost let herself be vulnerable again. But then she remembered where she was, who he was, and how this evening had started. "Someone important," she said simply. She picked up her equipment and started toward the door. Behind her, she could hear the murmur of conversations starting up again, people trying to pretend the last few minutes hadn't happened. But as she reached the entrance to the side hallway, she heard footsteps behind her. She turned to see Ethan following, looking, uncertain, and somehow younger than he had all evening. "Wait," he said, then seemed unsure what to say next. Aaliyah stopped and looked at him expectantly. "The song," he said again. "It felt like you were singing about something I understand. Someone I lost too." She studied his face, seeing honesty there for the first time all evening. The expensive clothes and perfect house couldn't hide the grief she recognized in his eyes. "Everyone loses someone," she said gently. "Not everyone learns how to see other people because of it." He flinched slightly at the words, but didn't argue. "You're right. I don't think I've been seeing much of anything lately." They stood in the hallway for a moment, the sounds of the party muffled behind them. Aaliyah felt her anger cooling, replaced by something more complicated. Curiosity, maybe. Or recognition. "I should go," she said finally. "Could I?" He hesitated, looking genuinely nervous for the first time all evening. "Could I buy you coffee sometime? To apologize properly?" Aaliyah shifted her guitar case to her other hand, considering. Every smart instinct told her to say no. This man lived in a different world, one where people like her were invisible until they became inconvenient. Getting involved would only lead to disappointment. But the way he'd reacted to her song, the tears he couldn't hide, the genuine regret in his voice now, that felt real in a way nothing else about this evening had. "Maybe," she said finally, "if you really want to apologize and not just make yourself feel better." "I do," he said quickly. "Really want to apologize. I mean, you didn't deserve what I said. What I did." She gave him a long look, trying to read his intentions. "One coffee, that's all." "One coffee," he agreed. She told him her number, and he typed it carefully into his phone. Then she walked out into the night air, leaving behind the warm lights and expensive conversations of Ethan Caldwell's world. As she loaded her equipment into her car, Aaliyah felt the adrenaline of the evening beginning to fade. She'd done something tonight that scared her. She'd let strangers see who she really was, and somehow, impossibly, one of those strangers had seen her back. She drove home through the dark streets, her mind replaying every moment of the evening. The dismissal, the song, the tears in Ethan's eyes, and his quiet question about coffee. By the time she reached her apartment, she was already wondering if she'd made a mistake by saying yes. But as she carried her guitar upstairs to her small, warm space, she realized something had shifted inside her. For years she'd been playing it safe, staying invisible, protecting herself from exactly the kind of humiliation she'd experienced tonight. But she'd also protected herself from being truly seen. Tonight, for just a few minutes, someone had seen her. And despite everything that had led to that moment, it felt like the beginning of something she couldn't quite name yet, something that might be worth the risk. The next morning arrived gray and drizzly, matching Aaliyah's uncertain mood. She'd barely slept, her mind replaying the events of the party over and over, the humiliation, the song, those tears in Ethan's eyes. It all felt like something that had happened to someone else. Her phone buzzed at 9:30, a text from an unknown number. "Good morning. This is Ethan Caldwell. I know you said maybe about coffee, but I'm hoping you meant yes. There's a small cafe called Brewed Awakening on 5th Street. Would 11 work for you?" Aaliyah stared at the message for a long time. She could ignore it, pretend last night never happened, and go back to her safe, invisible life. That would be the smart thing to do. But she kept thinking about the way he'd looked when her song ended, like someone had shaken him awake from a long sleep. 11 is fine, she typed back. "Thank you. I'll be the one who owes you an apology." Despite herself, Aaliyah almost smiled. At least he remembered that part. She chose her clothes carefully, jeans and a simple sweater, nothing fancy. This wasn't a date. This was an apology that she was accepting out of curiosity more than forgiveness. Brewed Awakening was exactly the kind of place she would have chosen herself. Small, cozy, with mismatched chairs and local art on the walls. The kind of coffee shop where people actually read books instead of just holding them as accessories. She spotted Ethan immediately. He sat in a corner booth, looking oddly out of place in his expensive clothes. He was early, she noticed, and he looked nervous. When he saw her approach, he stood up quickly, almost knocking over his coffee. "Thank you for coming," he said, gesturing for her to sit across from him. "I wasn't sure you would." "I wasn't sure I would either," she admitted, settling into the booth. He looked different in daylight, without the armor of his expensive party and perfect house. Younger somehow, and more uncertain. The confidence from last night was gone, replaced by something that looked almost like fear. "I ordered you a coffee," he said, sliding a steaming mug across the table. "I didn't know what you liked, so I got you the same thing I got. I hope that's okay." She took a sip. It was good, dark and rich with just a hint of sweetness. "It's fine. Thank you." They sat in silence for a moment, both seeming unsure how to begin this conversation. Finally, Ethan spoke. "What I said last night was wrong. Not just rude. Wrong. Your music was beautiful, and I was—" He paused, searching for words. "I was dealing with my own stuff, and I took it out on you. That's not okay." Aaliyah studied his face, looking for signs that this was just guilt talking. But his eyes were direct, honest. Whatever had happened to him last night, it was still happening. "Thank you," she said simply. "I don't want you to forgive me just because I apologized," he continued. "I want you to know that I heard what you sang, about being invisible, about being looked through, and I realized that's exactly what I'd been doing, not just to you, but to a lot of people." She was quiet, letting him talk. "The person you lost," he said carefully, "in your song. Was it recent?" Aaliyah hesitated. This was getting into territory she usually kept private, but something about his genuine interest, the way he was really listening, made her want to answer. "My grandmother," she said finally. 2 years ago. She raised me after my parents died. She was the only person who really understood my music." "I'm sorry," he said, and she could tell he meant it. "That's a big loss." "What about you?" she asked. "You said you understood something about losing people." Ethan's hands tightened around his coffee mug. "My father, also 2 years ago. Heart attack, very sudden." "I'm sorry, too." They sat with that shared understanding for a moment, two people who'd lost the most important person in their world, trying to figure out how to keep living afterward. "Is that why you were so upset last night?" Aaliyah asked gently. "Something about your father?" Ethan nodded slowly. "It was the anniversary of his death, yesterday, and my mother keeps pushing me to move on, to find balance, to be social. So I threw this party because it seemed like something he would have done, but I hated every minute of it. So you took it out on the background music." "So I took it out on you," he corrected, "and I'm ashamed of that." Aaliyah felt some of her defenses softening. This wasn't the arrogant man from last night. This was someone struggling with grief, just like she had been. "Grief makes us do strange things," she said. "I spent 6 months after my grandmother died, refusing to play music at all. It hurt too much." "What changed your mind?" "Bills," she said with a small smile, and realizing that she would have been upset with me for wasting the gift she helped me develop. Ethan smiled too, the first real smile she'd seen from him. It transformed his whole face, making him look less like a businessman and more like a person. "Your song last night," he said, "it wasn't just about being invisible, was it? It was about grief too." She nodded. "Most of my real songs are, the ones I don't play at parties." "Would you?" He hesitated, then pressed on. "Would you play for me again sometime? Your real music, I mean, not background music." "Why would you want to hear that?" "Because last night was the first time in 2 years that I've felt anything besides anger or emptiness. Your music woke something up in me that I thought was gone forever." The honesty in his voice caught her off guard. She'd expected guilt, maybe some wealthy man's attempt to make himself feel better about his bad behavior. She hadn't expected this raw vulnerability. "I don't usually play my personal songs for other people," she said, carefully. "I understand. But if you ever change your mind—" He left the offer hanging between them, not pushing, just letting her know the door was open. They talked for another hour, easy conversation that surprised them both. He told her about the pressure of running his father's company, about feeling trapped between what everyone expected of him and what he actually wanted. She told him about her music, about the small gigs that paid the bills and the songs she wrote alone in her apartment that nobody else had ever heard. When they finally left the cafe, the gray morning had turned into a surprisingly pleasant afternoon. "Thank you," Ethan said as they stood on the sidewalk outside. "Not just for accepting my apology, but for giving me a chance to make it properly." "Thank you for meaning it," Aaliyah replied. They stood there for a moment, neither quite ready to end this unexpected connection. "Could we do this again?" Ethan asked. "Just coffee and conversation. No pressure, no expectations. I'd like to get to know you better, as a person, not as background music." Aaliyah considered this. Everything rational told her to keep her distance. They came from completely different worlds, and mixing those worlds usually ended badly for people like her. But there was something about the way he'd listened today, really listened, that made her want to take another small risk. "Maybe," she said, "but not in your world next time. Somewhere more neutral." "Wherever you want," he agreed immediately. "You choose the place." 2 days later, they met in Riverside Park. It was Aaliyah's suggestion, public but peaceful, a place where they could talk without the weight of either of their worlds pressing down on them. Ethan was already there when she arrived, sitting on a bench near the pond, feeding breadcrumbs to a small group of ducks. He looked more relaxed in casual clothes, more like himself. "You're early," she observed, settling beside him on the bench. "I was afraid you might change your mind," he admitted. "I brought backup entertainment in case you didn't show up." He gestured at the ducks. "Smart planning." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the ducks paddle around the pond. It was easier to talk when they weren't looking directly at each other, Aaliyah realized. "Tell me about your music," Ethan said eventually. "Not the business side, the part that matters to you." "Why do you want to know?" "Because when you played that song at my house, it was like you were speaking a language I'd forgotten I understood. I used to love music before I got so caught up in everything else." Aaliyah pulled her knees up to her chest, considering how much to share. "My grandmother always said music was about telling the truth when words weren't enough," she said finally. "That's what I try to do with my songs. Find the truth in whatever I'm feeling and translate it into something other people can understand." "Is that why you played that particular song at my party?" "Partly, but also because I was angry and hurt and tired of being invisible." "I'm glad you did," Ethan said quietly, "even though it made me cry in front of 30 people. "Why did it make you cry?" He was quiet for so long that she thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Because you sang about losing someone who really saw you. And I realized I'd been so busy being angry about losing my father that I'd stopped seeing anyone else, including myself." Aaliyah felt something shift inside her chest. This wasn't just guilt or curiosity from him anymore. This was recognition, the kind that happened when two people realized they'd been carrying the same kind of pain. "What was your father like?" she asked. "Everything I'm trying to be and everything I'm afraid I'm not," Ethan said with a sad laugh. "He was successful, but he never forgot where he came from. He treated everyone with respect, from the CEO of his biggest client to the person who cleaned his office. He would have been horrified by how I acted toward you." Maybe he would have understood that you were hurting. Ethan looked at her with surprise. "You're being generous." "I'm being honest. Grief makes us smaller sometimes before it makes us bigger." They talked until the sun started to set, sharing stories about the people they'd lost and the ways those losses had changed them. It was the kind of conversation Aaliyah hadn't had with anyone since her grandmother died, deep and real and completely unguarded. When they finally parted ways, she realized something had changed. The careful walls she'd built around herself had developed a small crack, and Ethan had somehow found his way through it. That night, she called her Uncle Jonah. "How was your fancy party, baby girl?" he asked when he picked up the phone. Jonah was her grandmother's younger brother, a retired jazz musician who lived across town in a house filled with instruments and memories. He was the only family she had left, and the only person who understood her music the way her grandmother had. "Complicated," she said, settling into her couch with a cup of tea. "Complicated how?" She told him everything, the humiliation, the song, Ethan's reaction, and their 2 conversations since then. Jonah listened without interrupting, the way musicians do when they're trying to hear all the notes in a melody. "So what's got you worried?" he asked when she finished. "Everything. He's white, he's rich, he lives in a completely different world. People like him don't usually want anything real with people like me." "People like him? You know what I mean, Uncle Jonah." "I know what you think you mean, but from what you've told me, this man heard your truth and recognized it. That's not nothing, Aaliyah. It's not everything either." "No," Jonah agreed, "but it's a start. Your grandmother always said you had to listen to more than just the words in a song. You had to listen to what was underneath them." "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means maybe you should listen to what this man is really saying instead of what you're afraid he means." That night, Aaliyah sat at her keyboard and tried to work on new music. But instead of her usual melancholy melodies, something lighter kept wanting to emerge, something that felt almost like hope. She pushed it away, not ready for hope yet, but it kept coming back. The next afternoon, her phone buzzed with another text from Ethan. "I know we didn't plan to meet again so soon, but I have a question. Do you have a place where you practice? Somewhere you feel comfortable playing your real music?" She stared at the message, unsure how to respond. "Why?" she typed back. "Because I'd like to hear it again. And I think you might be more comfortable in your own space." It was presumptuous, she thought, but it was also perceptive. She did feel more comfortable in her own space, surrounded by her instruments and her grandmother's photos and the accumulated warmth of years of making music. "I have a small studio space I rent," she replied. "Nothing fancy. Could I see it sometime?" "Only if you want to share it." Aaliyah hesitated for a long time before responding. Letting him into her practice space felt like a much bigger risk than coffee shops and park benches. That space was sacred to her, the place where she was most herself. But something about the careful way he'd asked, the way he'd said, "Only if you want to share it," made her trust him a little more. "Tomorrow afternoon, 2 p.m. I'll text you the address." "Thank you. I promise to just listen." The next day, Aaliyah spent an hour cleaning her studio space, then laughed at herself for caring what he thought of it. The space was perfect the way it was, a small room in a converted warehouse filled with instruments and music stands and the accumulated chaos of creativity. When Ethan arrived, he looked around with genuine interest, not the polite curiosity she'd expected. "This is incredible," he said, running his fingers lightly over the keys of an old piano in the corner. "How long have you been renting this place?" 3 years. It's not much, but it's mine." "It feels alive," he said, and she knew he understood. She sat down at her keyboard, suddenly nervous. Playing for one person in her own space felt more intimate than playing for 30 strangers at a party. "What would you like to hear?" she asked. "Whatever you want to play, your choice completely." She started with something simple, a melody that had been running through her head all week. But as she played, she found herself moving into deeper territory, songs about longing and loss, about the space between who you are and who you want to be. Ethan sat perfectly still, his eyes closed, just listening, not judging, not analyzing, just receiving what she was, offering. When she finished the last song, the silence stretched between them like a held breath. "Thank you," he said finally, his voice soft with something that might have been awe. I don't have words for what that was." "You don't need words," she said. "That's what the music is for." He looked at her then with an expression she'd never seen before, complete attention, complete presence, like she was the only thing in the world worth looking at. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "Sure. Why did you let me come here? After what happened at the party, most people wouldn't have given me a second chance, let alone a third one." Aaliyah considered the question, trying to find the truth underneath her own uncertainty. "Because when you heard my song that night, you really heard it," she said finally. "Most people listen to music like it's wallpaper, but you listened like it mattered, like I mattered." "You do matter," he said simply. "Your music, your story, your truth, it all matters." Something warm and dangerous bloomed in Aaliyah's chest. This was how hearts got broken, she knew. By trusting moments like this one, by believing that recognition could bridge the gap between different worlds. But as she looked at Ethan, sitting in her sacred space and listening to her music like it was treasure, She realized she was already in too deep to protect herself completely. The crack in her walls had become a door, and despite all her fears and all her logic, she was starting to want to open it. The following evening, Aaliyah found herself standing outside Ethan's front door with a container of homemade soup and a heart full of second thoughts. He'd mentioned during their conversation at the studio that he'd been living on takeout since his housekeeper quit, and she'd impulsively offered to cook for him. Now, looking at the expensive house with its perfect landscaping, she wondered what she'd been thinking. Ethan answered the door in jeans and a simple t-shirt, his hair slightly messed up like he'd been running his hands through it. He looked more human than she'd ever seen him. "You came," he said, genuine relief in his voice. "I said I would." "I know, but I was worried you might change your mind. Come in, please." The house felt different at night, without the crowd of strangers. It was still expensive and perfect, but somehow less cold. Ethan led her to the kitchen, which was enormous and barely looked used. "I have to admit something," he said as she set the soup container on the counter. "I don't actually know how to use most of the things in here. My father was the cook in the family." "What do you usually eat?" "Whatever gets delivered fastest." He looked embarrassed. "I know how that sounds." "It sounds lonely," Aaliyah said gently. Something shifted in his expression. "Yeah, it is." She opened cabinets until she found bowls and ladled out the soup, while Ethan watched with fascination, as if cooking were some kind of magic he'd never witnessed before. "Chicken and rice," she said, handing him a bowl. "My grandmother's recipe. Nothing fancy, but it's filling." They sat at his kitchen island, which was big enough to seat 8 people, but felt oddly intimate with just the 2 of them. Ethan took a spoonful and closed his eyes. "This is incredible," he said. "When's the last time I had food that actually tasted like someone cared about it?" "When's the last time someone cooked for you?" "My father, probably. Before he died?" He paused. "My mother doesn't cook, and I never learned. Another way I'm failing to live up to his example." "You're not failing," Aaliyah said firmly. "You're grieving. There's a difference." They ate in comfortable silence for a while. Through the large windows, Aaliyah could see the backyard with its perfect pool and manicured gardens. It was beautiful, but it felt like a magazine photo, something to look at, not live in. "Can I ask you something?" Ethan said eventually. "Sure." "What was your grandmother like? You talk about her music, but what was she like as a person?" Aaliyah smiled, the question bringing up warm memories instead of painful ones for the first time in months. "Fierce," she said without hesitation. "Tiny woman, barely 5 feet tall, but she could stare down anyone. She worked 3 jobs to put herself through nursing school, then worked as a nurse for 40 years while raising me. But at night, she'd sit at this old piano we got from a church sale, and she'd play jazz standards until the neighbors complained." "She sounds amazing." She was. She used to say that music was the closest thing to prayer she knew, a way to touch something bigger than yourself. "Do you believe that?" "I think I'm starting to again." After dinner, they moved to the living room where Aaliyah curled up in one corner of the massive couch and Ethan sat on the other end, close enough to talk easily, but far enough to give her space. "Your turn," she said. "What was your father really like?" Ethan was quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands. "Everything good about me came from him," he said finally. "The work ethic, the sense of responsibility, the idea that success should be shared, not hoarded, but also the simple stuff. He taught me to change oil in a car, to throw a baseball, to treat people with dignity no matter who they were." "What happened to all of that?" "I don't know. After he died, it felt like I had to become someone harder to survive. The business world isn't kind to grief. Neither's my mother, honestly. She wanted me to move on and stay focused and not let emotions cloud my judgment." "So you stopped feeling anything?" "I tried to. It seemed safer." "Was it?" Ethan laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Last night was the first time in 2 years I didn't have nightmares. So no, I don't think it was safer. I think it was just emptier." They talked until midnight, sharing stories and silences with equal comfort. When Aaliyah finally said she should go home, Ethan walked her to her car with obvious reluctance. "Thank you," he said as she unlocked her door. "For the food, for the conversation, for all of it. Thank you for letting me see your house without 30 strangers in it." "It's better with you here," he said quietly. The words hung between them, carrying weight they both felt, but neither was ready to acknowledge fully. "Ethan," Aaliyah said carefully. "I know," he said quickly. "I know this is complicated. I know we're from different places. I'm not trying to push anything. I like who I am when I'm with you." "Who are you when you're with me?" "Someone who remembers what it feels like to be human." The next morning, Aaliyah woke up with Ethan's words still echoing in her head. She spent the day trying to focus on her music, but her concentration kept drifting to the way he'd looked at her when she'd handed him that bowl of soup, like she'd given him something precious. That evening, her phone rang. Daniel's name appeared on the screen, which surprised her. She'd gotten his number from Rosa, who'd gotten it from Ethan in case there were ever any issues with gigs. "Aaliyah, this is Daniel Reeves. I was at Ethan's party the other night." "I remember. I'm calling because I'm worried about him. He's been different since that night. Distracted, unfocused. He missed 2 important meetings yesterday." Aaliyah felt a chill run through her. "What does that have to do with me?" "Look, I don't know what happened between you two after the party, but whatever it was, it's affecting his work. Ethan's got a responsibility to his company, to his father's legacy. He can't afford to get emotionally involved with complications right now." "Complications?" "You know what I mean. He's got a position to maintain, a certain image. Getting involved with—" Daniel paused, clearly choosing his words carefully. Getting involved outside his social circle could be damaging to his career. The words hit her like a physical blow, even though they weren't entirely unexpected. This was exactly what she'd been afraid of, being seen as a complication, a problem to be managed. "I think you should talk to Ethan about this," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "I tried. He won't listen. But maybe if you stepped back, gave him some space to get his head on straight." "Are you asking me to stop seeing him?" "I'm asking you to think about what's best for him. And for yourself. This kind of thing, it doesn't usually end well for anyone involved." After Daniel hung up, Aaliyah sat in her kitchen staring at her phone. Part of her was angry. Who was Daniel to tell her what was best for anyone? But another part, the part that had been protecting her for years, whispered that he might be right. She and Ethan did come from different worlds, and maybe those worlds couldn't be bridged without someone getting hurt. The next day, she deliberately didn't answer when Ethan called. When he texted asking if she was okay, she replied that she was busy with work. It wasn't a lie, she had 3 small gigs lined up for the weekend. But it wasn't the whole truth either. By Sunday evening, she was sitting in her uncle's living room, seeking the wisdom she couldn't find on her own. "So this friend of his called you," Jonah said after she'd explained the situation, "and told you to back off because you're a complication." "Basically, yeah. And you're listening to him, why?" "Because maybe he's right. Maybe I am a complication Ethan doesn't need." Jonah set down his coffee and gave her the look that meant he was about to say something she needed to hear but didn't want to. "Baby girl, you've been protecting yourself from disappointment so long. You're protecting yourself from happiness, too." "Uncle Jonah, no, listen to me. I watched you shut down after your grandmother died. I watched you take smaller and smaller risks, play safer and safer music until you were barely living at all. Then this man comes along and hears your truth, and suddenly you're writing new songs and cooking dinner for people and letting yourself feel things again. That doesn't mean it's smart." "Smart?" Jonah laughed. "Baby, love isn't supposed to be smart. It's supposed to be brave." "Who said anything about love?" "You did. Every time you talk about him, your whole face changes. You light up like you used to when you were little, and your grandmother would play piano with you." Aaliyah felt tears prick her eyes. What if Daniel's right? What if I'm just setting myself up to get hurt? What if you're setting yourself up to be happy? What if this man is exactly what he seems to be? Someone who sees you and values you and wants to build something real with you? And what if he's not? Then you'll handle it. But don't make that decision for him, and don't let his friend make it for you. That night, Aaliyah tried to write music, but nothing would come. She sat at her keyboard, fingers hovering over the keys, but every melody felt false. Her phone buzzed with another text from Ethan. "I don't know what I did wrong, but I miss talking to you. If you need space, I understand. But please don't disappear without telling me why." She stared at the message for a long time, Daniel's words warring with her uncle's advice and her own confused feelings. Finally, she typed back, "Can we meet tomorrow? I need to talk to you about something." "Of course. Wherever you want. The park, same bench as before. 6 p.m. I'll be there." But the next morning brought unexpected complications. Aaliyah woke up to find 3 missed calls from her landlord and a notice taped to her door. The building was being sold, and all tenants had 30 days to vacate. She spent the day calling apartments she couldn't afford and studios she couldn't reach. Her carefully structured life, suddenly feeling like it was built on sand. By the time she arrived at the park that evening, she was exhausted and overwhelmed, and not at all prepared for the conversation she'd planned to have. Ethan was already there, looking anxious. When he saw her face, his expression shifted immediately to concern. "What's wrong?" She sat down heavily beside him. "Everything's falling apart." "What happened?" She told him about the eviction notice, about the impossible rent prices and the studio spaces with year-long waiting lists. As she talked, she could feel herself getting smaller, retreating back into the protective shell she'd been slowly emerging from. "Hey," Ethan said gently when she finished. "Look at me." She did, and saw nothing but genuine care in his eyes. "We'll figure this out," he said. "I know people. I have resources. We can find you something." "That's exactly the problem," she said, pulling away slightly. "What do you mean?" This was the conversation she'd come here to have, but now it felt harder than she'd expected. "Daniel called me," she said finally. Ethan's expression darkened. "What did he say?" "That I'm a complication you don't need. That getting involved with me could damage your career, your reputation." "And you believe him?" "I believe that we come from different worlds, and I believe that when those worlds collide, people like me usually get hurt." Ethan was quiet for a long moment, his jaw tight with what looked like controlled anger. "Did Daniel tell you that I've been sleeping through the night for the first time in 2 years?" he said finally. "Did he mention that I actually laughed last week, or that I've started playing piano again because your music reminded me what joy sounded like?" "Ethan, did he tell you that you've made me remember who I used to be before grief turned me into someone I don't even recognize?" "It doesn't matter," Aaliyah said, even though every word was making her heart ache. "Daniel's right about one thing. This is complicated. Too complicated. So what are you saying?" "I'm saying maybe we should step back. Give you space to focus on your life, and give me space to figure out mine." The silence that followed was deafening. A young couple walked by with their dog, their easy laughter a sharp contrast to the weight settling between Aaliyah and Ethan. "If that's what you want," Ethan said finally, his voice carefully controlled. "It's what makes sense. That's not what I asked." Aaliyah looked at him, seeing the hurt he was trying to hide behind reasonableness. But she also saw the expensive watch, the perfect haircut, the confidence that came from never having to worry about rent or eviction notices. "It's what I want," she lied. Ethan nodded once, sharp and final. "Okay, I understand." He stood to leave, then paused. "For what it's worth," he said, not looking at her, "you're not a complication to me. You're the first real thing that's happened to me in 2 years. But I guess that's not enough." After he walked away, Aaliyah sat on the bench until the sun set and the park emptied around her. She told herself she'd made the smart choice, the safe choice. But as she finally stood to leave, she realized that smart and safe felt an awful lot like empty. And for the first time in years, empty wasn't enough anymore. The next 2 weeks passed in a haze of apartment hunting and sleepless nights. Aaliyah threw herself into finding new housing, taking extra gigs, anything to distract herself from the Ethan-shaped hole in her daily life. She found a tiny studio apartment across town that ate up most of her savings but would keep her off the streets. It was cramped and noisy, but it was hers, and it would have to be enough. On moving day, Rosa showed up with coffee and a determined expression. "This is ridiculous," she announced, surveying the boxes scattered around Aaliyah's old apartment. "What's ridiculous?" "You, moping around like someone died. That man has been calling me every other day asking if you're okay." Aaliyah paused in her packing. "Ethan's been calling you?" "Not directly. He calls the catering company asking if we have any events coming up that might need musicians. It's pretty transparent, Aaliyah." I told him I needed space. You told him you needed space because you're scared. There's a difference. Rosa. No, listen to me. I've watched you play it safe for 2 years. Safe jobs, safe music, safe feelings. And you've been miserable. I've been fine. You've been surviving. But that night at his party, when you played that song, that was the first time since your grandmother died that I saw you actually living. That evening, alone in her new apartment with boxes still unpacked around her, Aaliyah sat at her keyboard and tried to write. For the first time in weeks, music began to flow, but it was different from anything she'd written before. It wasn't just about loss anymore. It was about choice, about the space between fear and hope, about the risk of reaching for something that might not reach back. She played until her neighbors knocked on the wall, then played some more. By midnight, she had the beginning of something that felt true and brave and terrifying, something that felt like a song about second chances. 3 weeks after their conversation in the park, Aaliyah's new routine had settled into a comfortable emptiness. She woke up in her tiny studio apartment, practiced in the cramped space between her bed and kitchen, took whatever gigs she could find, and went to sleep to the sound of traffic outside her window. It was exactly the safe, predictable life she'd convinced herself she wanted. So why did she feel like she was slowly disappearing? She was setting up for a coffee shop gig on a Thursday evening when Rosa appeared at her table, looking uncharacteristically serious. "We need to talk," Rosa said without preamble. "I'm working," Aaliyah replied, adjusting her microphone. "After. This is important." The gig was typical. Background music for people focused on their laptops and conversations. Aaliyah played her safe repertoire and tried not to think about the song she'd been writing, the one that sat unfinished on her keyboard at home like a question she wasn't ready to answer. When she finished her set, Rosa was waiting with 2 cups of coffee and a determined expression. "Ethan's mother came to see me today," Rosa said without warning. Aaliyah nearly dropped her guitar case. "What?" "Margaret Caldwell showed up at my office this afternoon. Apparently she's been watching her son turn into someone she doesn't recognize, and she thinks it has something to do with you." "That's ridiculous. I haven't seen him in weeks." "That's exactly her point." Rosa leaned forward, her voice gentle but firm. "Aaliyah, she told me things about what Ethan's been like since his father died, and what he's been like since he met you. The difference is significant." Aaliyah's stomach churned. "What kind of things?" "She said he hasn't played piano in 2 years, not since his father's funeral. But last week she heard him playing at midnight, jazz standards, the kind of music his father loved. That doesn't mean..." "She said he's been asking her about grief counseling, about his father's favorite charities, about things he's been avoiding for 2 years. Rosa paused. She also said Daniel has been filling his head with ideas about appropriate relationships and maintaining his image. The pieces clicked into place in Aaliyah's mind. Daniel's phone call, his carefully chosen words about complications in social circles. "She wants to meet with you," Rosa continued. "Both of you, tomorrow night." "Rosa, I can't..." "She's not what you think," Rosa interrupted. "I expected some ice queen protecting her precious son from the inappropriate black girl, but she's not like that. She's worried about him, and she thinks you might be the key to helping him find his way back to himself." That night, Aaliyah called Uncle Jonah. "So the man's mother wants to see you," he said after she explained the situation. "It feels like a trap. Or it feels like a woman who loves her son and recognizes something you're too scared to see. Which is that maybe this isn't about different worlds, baby girl. Maybe it's just about 2 people who found something real and are too afraid to fight for it." The next evening, Aaliyah found herself standing outside an elegant restaurant in downtown, wearing her best dress and fighting the urge to run away. Through the window, she could see a woman with silver hair sitting alone at a corner table, checking her watch. Margaret Caldwell looked exactly like what she was. Old money, careful breeding, and the kind of confidence that came from never having to question your place in the world. But when she looked up and saw Aaliyah approaching, her smile was genuinely warm. "Miss Brooks," she said, standing to greet her. "Thank you for coming. I know this must seem strange." "A little," Aaliyah admitted, settling into the chair across from her. "I'm sure Rosa told you why I wanted to meet with you. My son has been struggling since his father died, and I believe you might be able to help him in ways I cannot." "Mrs. Caldwell, I'm not sure what you think happened between us. I think, Margaret interrupted gently, that you reminded him what it feels like to be fully alive, and I think someone convinced you that was a bad thing. The waiter appeared, and Margaret ordered wine for both of them, while Aaliyah tried to process this conversation that was nothing like what she'd expected. Daniel told you I was a complication, Margaret continued when they were alone again. Am I correct? Something like that. Daniel's a good friend to Ethan, but he's also young and focused on all the wrong things: success, image, maintaining appearances. Margaret sighed. I'm afraid I may have contributed to that mindset after my husband died. I was so worried about Ethan falling apart that I pushed him to stay strong, stay focused, stay emotionally distant. You were protecting him. I was enabling him to avoid dealing with his grief. There's a difference, and it took watching him with you to help me see it. The wine arrived, and Margaret took a careful sip before continuing. Ethan's father would have loved you, she said simply. The statement caught Aaliyah completely off guard. You don't know anything about me. I know you got my son to cry for the first time in 2 years. I know he's been playing music again since he met you. I know he's asking questions about moving forward instead of just surviving. Margaret leaned forward slightly. And I know that when he talks about you, he sounds like the man his father raised him to be, not the closed-off businessman he's been pretending to be. Mrs. Caldwell. Margaret, please. And let me tell you something about my family, Miss Brooks. My husband came from nothing. His father was a mechanic, his mother cleaned houses. He built his company from the ground up, and he never forgot where he came from. The idea that Ethan would choose a partner based on social class or bank accounts would horrify him. Aaliyah felt tears starting to form and fought them back. Even if that's true, Ethan and I decided to step back. It was mutual. Was it? Or did someone convince you that you weren't good enough for my son, when the truth is he's barely good enough for you? The conversation that followed was unlike anything Aaliyah had expected. Margaret talked about her late husband, about the kind of man Ethan had been before grief hardened him, about her own regrets in pushing him toward emotional numbness. I want my son back, she said finally. The real Ethan, not this hollow version who goes through the motions of living. And I think you're the only person who's been able to reach that real person. What are you asking me to do? I'm asking you to consider that maybe what you have is worth fighting for. And I'm asking you to know that if you choose to fight for it, you won't be doing it alone. That night, Aaliyah sat in her apartment, staring at the unfinished song on her music stand. Margaret's words echoed in her head, mixing with Uncle Jonah's advice and her own confused feelings. For 2 years, she'd been playing it safe. Safe music, safe feelings, safe choices that protected her from disappointment. But safe had also protected her from joy, from connection, from the possibility that someone might see her and choose her anyway. She picked up her guitar and began to play. The melody that emerged was the one she'd been working on, but now the words came easily. I built walls so high I forgot about the view, kept my heart so safe it forgot what hearts can do. But you came along with your broken smile, and suddenly, safe didn't seem worthwhile. Maybe love is supposed to be a little scary. Maybe trust means taking chances you can't see. Maybe the best things in life don't come with guarantees. Maybe you're worth the risk of being free. She played until her fingers hurt, pouring all her confusion and hope and fear into the music. When she finally set the guitar down, she knew what she had to do. But first, she had to understand exactly what she was fighting against. The next morning, she called Daniel. Aaliyah, he said, sounding surprised. I wasn't expecting to hear from you. We need to talk about Ethan and about what you said to me. They met at a neutral cafe downtown. Daniel arrived, looking polished and professional, every inch the successful businessman protecting his friend's interests. Look, he said before she could speak. I hope you don't think what I said was personal. I just know how these things go. Different backgrounds, different expectations. It gets complicated fast. You mean it gets complicated for him? For both of you. Ethan has responsibilities, a position to maintain. And you, he paused, clearly searching for diplomatic words. You deserve someone who can be with you completely, without having to worry about what other people think. Someone more like me, you mean? Someone who fits better into your world. Aaliyah studied his face, seeing genuine belief that he was protecting them both. It would have been easier if he'd been obviously prejudiced or cruel. Instead, he was just convinced that love couldn't bridge certain gaps. "Can I tell you what I think?" she said finally. "Of course. I think you're scared. I think Ethan has been your safe, controlled friend for 2 years, and you're afraid that if he starts feeling things again, he might become someone you don't recognize." Daniel's expression shifted, surprise replacing his polite certainty. "I think," Aaliyah continued, "you've gotten comfortable with him. Being half alive because it meant you didn't have to deal with him changing or growing or needing things you couldn't give him. That's not, and I think you told me to back off, not because you were protecting him from me, but because you were protecting yourself from losing the version of him that you could control." The silence stretched between them, heavy with recognition. "Maybe you're right," Daniel said finally. "Maybe I've been scared of losing him, but that doesn't mean I was wrong about the complications." "No," Aaliyah agreed, "but it means the complications aren't what you said they were." That afternoon, Aaliyah called Ethan. Her hands shook as she dialed, and her heart pounded while the phone rang. "Aaliyah?" His voice was cautious, hopeful. "Hi, can we meet? There are things I need to say to you." "Of course. Where?" "Your house," she said, surprising herself. "If that's okay, I think we need to have this conversation somewhere private." "I'll be here." An hour later, she stood on his doorstep again, but this time she wasn't carrying soup or uncertainty. This time, she was carrying a song and a decision. Ethan opened the door, looking tired but alert. He'd lost weight, she noticed, and there were shadows under his eyes that hadn't been there before. "Come in," he said softly. They sat in his living room, the same couch where they had talked about their fathers and their grief, but now the space between them felt enormous. "I talked to your mother," Aaliyah said without preamble. Ethan's eyebrows shot up. "You what?" "She asked Rosa to arrange a meeting. We had dinner last night." "What did she say?" "That you've been playing piano again, that you've been asking about grief counseling, that you sound like your father's son when you talk about me." Ethan was quiet, processing this information. "I also talked to Daniel," she continued. "I wanted to understand why he said what he said." "And?" "I think he's scared of losing his friend, and I think I was scared of being disappointed." She paused, gathering courage. "But I'm more scared of losing you than I am of being hurt." Something shifted in Ethan's expression. Hope, tentative but growing. "Aaliyah, let me finish. I wrote something for you, a song, and I want you to hear it before we talk about anything else." He nodded, and she picked up her guitar from where she'd left it by the door. "This is about being scared," she said, "about walls and safety and what happens when you decide that maybe being safe isn't the same as being alive." She began to play, her voice stronger and clearer than it had ever been. "I built walls so high I forgot about the view, kept my heart so safe it forgot what hearts can do. But you came along with your broken smile, and suddenly, safe didn't seem worthwhile." Maybe love is supposed to be a little scary. Maybe trust means taking chances you can't see. Maybe the best things in life don't come with guarantees. Maybe you're worth the risk of being free. I could keep hiding behind what makes sense, stay small and careful behind my defense, or I could step into the light you're showing me and see what we could be if we were brave enough to breathe. When she finished, the silence was profound. Ethan was staring at her with an expression of wonder and something that looked like relief. "You wrote that for me?" he asked finally. "I wrote it for us. If there's going to be an us." "Is there? Going to be an us?" Aaliyah set down her guitar and moved closer to him on the couch, close enough to take his hands in hers. "I think there already is," she said. "The question is whether we're brave enough to let it be real." "I've missed you," he said simply. "These past weeks have been like holding my breath." "I've missed you too, but I needed to understand something." "What?" "That this is going to be hard sometimes. People are going to have opinions about us, about whether we make sense together, and I needed to know that you'd choose us anyway." "Of course I'd choose us," Ethan said immediately. "Aaliyah, you're not some complication in my life. You're the thing that makes my life make sense." "Even when it's messy?" Even when people like Daniel think you should find someone more appropriate? Especially then. His grip on her hands tightened. I don't want appropriate. I don't want safe or convenient or socially acceptable. I want real. I want you. And I want to try, she said. Really try, not just until the first time it gets difficult. So where does that leave us? Aaliyah looked around his beautiful, expensive house, then looked back at him. I think it leaves us figuring it out as we go, building something that works for both of us, not for anyone else's expectations. I like the sound of that. Good, because I have some conditions. Ethan smiled, the first real smile she'd seen from him in weeks. I'm listening. First, no more letting other people decide what's best for us. If we have problems, we talk to each other, not to friends who think they know better. Agreed. Second, I need you to understand that I'm not going to change who I am to fit into your world, but I also need you to know that I'm not asking you to give up everything about yours. What are you asking? I'm asking you to build something new with me, something that's ours, not theirs or mine. Ethan was quiet for a moment, considering. Can I add a condition? Sure. I want to meet your uncle. Officially, I mean. As someone who's important to you and who I want to know. The request surprised her with its thoughtfulness. You want to meet Uncle Jonah? I want to know the people who matter to you. I want them to know that you matter to me. Okay, but I should warn you. He's going to ask you about your intentions. Good. I hope he does. They talked until midnight, making plans and setting boundaries and dreaming about what their life might look like if they were brave enough to build it together. It wasn't going to be simple or easy. They both knew that. There would be awkward dinners with his business associates and conversations with family members who didn't understand. There would be moments when their different backgrounds created friction and times when they would have to choose each other over the comfort of their separate worlds. But as Aaliyah fell asleep that night in Ethan's arms, surrounded by the quiet luxury of his house and the solid warmth of his presence, she realized that complicated didn't have to mean impossible. It could just mean worth fighting for. 2 months later, Aaliyah stood on a small stage in the back room of a local restaurant, looking out at a crowd that was actually listening to her music. Real music, not background ambiance, songs she'd written, stories she wanted to tell. In the front row, Ethan sat next to Uncle Jonah, both of them focused completely on her performance. They'd become unlikely friends over the past weeks, bonding over their shared love of jazz and their mutual dedication to making sure Aaliyah pursued the music career she deserved. Margaret was there too, having surprised everyone by becoming one of Aaliyah's strongest supporters. She'd connected her with a music venue owner who specialized in showcasing emerging artists and had quietly helped fund this first real showcase performance. Even Daniel had come, looking slightly uncomfortable but making an obvious effort to understand what had captured his friend's heart so completely. As Aaliyah began her final song of the evening, she caught Ethan's eye and smiled. This song was the one she'd played at his party, but she'd rewritten the ending. Where it had once been about loss and invisibility, it now told the story of being seen, being chosen, being worth fighting for. The applause was genuine and enthusiastic, and as the crowd began to mingle afterward, Aaliyah felt something she'd never experienced before, the satisfaction of sharing her truth with people who wanted to hear it. You were incredible, Ethan said when he reached her, pulling her into a hug that felt like coming home. It felt incredible, she agreed. Thank you for believing I could do this. Thank you for letting me be here to see it. Later that night, they sat on his back patio under the stars, her guitar resting against the wall behind them. The pool glowed softly in the darkness, and the city lights twinkled in the distance like earthbound stars. I have something to ask you, Ethan said, his voice nervous in a way that made her pay attention. What? Move in with me. Aaliyah turned to look at him, surprised. Ethan, I know it's fast, and I know you just got settled in your new apartment, but I hate the thought of you in that tiny space when there's all this room here, and I hate going to sleep without you and waking up without you. That's a big step. I know, but I'm ready for big steps, are you? Aaliyah considered the question, thinking about her cramped studio apartment and her careful, safe routine. Then she thought about the life they'd been building together. The music she was finally brave enough to share, the way Ethan looked at her like she was exactly what he'd been hoping to find. I have conditions, she said finally. Ethan grinned. I expected you would. I want space for my music. A real practice room, not just a corner somewhere. Done. There's a whole room upstairs that gets amazing acoustics. I want to keep some independence. My own bank account, my own car, my own friends. Of course. And I want us to host dinner parties, real ones, with interesting people and good conversation and music that people actually listen to. I love that idea. And I want Uncle Jonah to feel welcome here whenever he wants to visit. Aaliyah, this is going to be our home. That means your family is always welcome. She leaned over and kissed him, tasting possibility and promises on his lips. Yes, she said against his mouth. Yes? Yes, I'll move in with you. Yes, I'm ready for big steps. Yes, I love you. It was the first time either of them had said the words out loud, and they hung in the warm night air like a benediction. I love you too, Ethan said, his voice soft with wonder. More than I knew it was possible to love anyone. A year later, they hosted their first official dinner party in their shared home. The guest list was eclectic. Uncle Jonah and Margaret, Rosa and her husband, Daniel and his new girlfriend, several musicians Aaliyah had met through her growing career, and a few of Ethan's business associates who had proven themselves capable of seeing beyond their own narrow assumptions. The evening was filled with laughter and spirited conversation and music that moved seamlessly between background ambiance and featured performance. Aaliyah played 3 songs during dinner, including one she'd written about second chances and the courage to build love on a foundation of truth rather than convenience. As the evening wound down and guests began to leave, Margaret approached Aaliyah in the kitchen where she was packing up leftover food. This was lovely, dear, she said, helping to wrap leftover dessert. Your uncle is a treasure, by the way. He's been telling me stories about your grandmother that have me convinced she and my husband would have been great friends. Thank you for helping make this happen, Aaliyah said. I know it means a lot to Ethan to have everyone together like this. It means a lot to me, too. You've given me my son back, you know. He was always there. He just needed permission to stop hiding. Margaret smiled. You both did. Later that night, as they cleaned up the remnants of the party, Ethan found Aaliyah on the patio where she'd gone to get some air. Penny for your thoughts, he said, settling beside her on the swing they'd installed a few months earlier. I was just thinking about my grandmother, Aaliyah said, about how she used to say that music was about telling the truth when words weren't enough. She was right. I think she would have loved tonight, all these different people, finding ways to connect and understand each other. She would have loved you being brave enough to let people hear your real music. She would have loved you, Aaliyah said simply. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the night sounds of the city around them. In the distance, someone was playing piano, jazz standards drifting through an open window somewhere in the neighborhood. Do you ever regret it? Ethan asked eventually. Taking the risk with us? Never, Aaliyah said without hesitation. Even on the hard days, even when people are weird about us or when we have to navigate complicated family dynamics, I never regret choosing love over safety. Good, Ethan said, pulling her closer. Because I have something I want to ask you, and it's going to require you to be brave one more time. Something in his tone made her turn to look at him. He was reaching into his pocket, his expression nervous but determined. Aaliyah Brooks, he said, dropping to one knee right there on their back patio under the stars. Will you marry me? The ring was perfect, simple and elegant, with a stone that caught the light from the house and threw it back in brilliant flashes. But more perfect than the ring was the way he was looking at her, like she was every good thing he'd ever hoped for. Are you sure? She asked, her heart pounding. Marriage is permanent, public. No hiding from anyone's opinions anymore. I'm sure, he said firmly. I want to build a life with you that's completely honest, completely committed, completely ours. I want to wake up every morning knowing that we chose each other, not just for right now, but forever. Even though it's going to be complicated sometimes, especially because it's going to be complicated sometimes, the best things always are. Aaliyah looked at this man who had learned to see her, really see her, who had fought his way back from grief partly because she'd shown him it was possible to feel deeply without being destroyed by it. She thought about all the walls they'd built and torn down, all the fears they'd faced and conquered, all the ways they'd chosen courage over comfort. "Yes," she said, her voice strong and clear. "Yes, I'll marry you." As he slipped the ring onto her finger and pulled her into his arms, Aaliyah thought about the song she'd played that first night at his party. The one about being invisible, about dreams and heartache and playing background music to other people's lives. She'd never have to play background music again, not in her career and not in her life. She was the star of her own story now, and she'd found someone brave enough to be the star of his own story too, someone willing to write new chapters together that neither of them could have imagined alone. In the distance, the unknown piano player finished their song and moved into something new, something hopeful and bright. Aaliyah smiled against Ethan's lips and held him tight, ready for whatever music they would make together, ready to keep being brave, keep choosing love, keep building something beautiful and real and completely their own. The song wasn't over. It was just beginning.